May 18th, 1980, a 300-mile-per-hour blast of hot rock and ash leveled 230 square miles of forest. On ridges closest to the volcano, the lateral blast ripped apart and uprooted trees, leaving nothing but shattered stumps and barren ash. The blast flowed over the landscape, felling and scattering trees like so many matchsticks. The blast moved like a roller coaster, skipping over steep ridges, leaving behind pockets of standing dead trees. On north-facing slopes, small trees and shrubs were sheltered by late-lying snowbanks. On the outer margins of the blast zone, the blast was no longer traveling fast enough to knock the trees down, but remained hot enough to scorch them. A key factor in the rapid pace of ecosystem reestablishment at Mount St. Helens was the spring timing of the eruption and its influence on survival. Plants that were dormant at the time of the eruption were able to resprout. Migrating animals like elk that were out of the area survived to return and feed on sprouting vegetation. Others, like gophers, mice, and amphibians, survived in place, safe in underground burrows and other sheltered locations. On cooler north-facing slopes, shrubs and small trees survived beneath a thick blanket of heavy, wet snow. These survivors provided an important source of food, shelter, and life-giving seed inside the blast zone. Mount St. Helens has created a unique natural laboratory for the study of ecosystem reestablishment following catastrophic disturbance. In the decades since the eruption, the chaotic jumble of dead and downed trees created by the volcano has developed into one of the most diverse and productive ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. Today, a thriving new forest is rising from the shattered remains of the old. The living laboratory that surrounds the volcano continues to be a focal point for important long-term studies, and lessons learned here are being applied around the world.
So you just watched a video on Mount St. Helens and what happened to the area after it erupted. Now you saw the changes that occurred a few years afterwards, and this is actually called ecological succession. So ecological succession is a series of changes that occur in a community over time. Something happened to the area, and now the community is trying to rebuild or kind of get back to what it was before. There's two types of ecological successions we're going to be talking about today. One is called primary succession, and the other is called secondary succession. So what has to happen first is there has to be some type of disturbance in the area, something that causes a change. So a disturbance is a temporary change in environmental conditions that causes a change in the ecosystem. An example of this might be a volcano erupting, or maybe retreating glaciers. So let's take a look at this volcano. In the path of this destruction of the lava flowing and the ash settling, you can see that in that path there's really nothing that's living there. Plants, animals, there's nothing there, and all you see is really just bare rock. Now, the same thing goes for glaciers, and glaciers are moving ice and snow. And what happens is, because of temperature changes, there's not as much precipitation in the form of snow that falls down. So you can see what occurs. In this case, in 1928, you can see how far that glacier was in that area. And then you take a look in 2003, it's not as far anymore. And you can see how the area where it once was a glacier, now it's just bare rock. There's no organisms that are living in the area. There's no trees, anything like that. So this actually leads us to primary succession. And primary succession is succession or changes that begins in an area where there was nothing that was there from the older community. So it was basically wiped out. You got to start from scratch. And in this case, what has to happen is you have to have some pioneer species. These are the first species to populate the area. So they can maybe come into the area from the wind. Maybe the wind blew in spores from a plant or seeds from a plant, and they settled in that area and started to grow. An example of a pioneer species would be lichen. And you can see lichen on rocks. So because the disturbance, like a volcano erupting, what happens is it's just bare rocks. There's really no nutrients in the soil. So what these lichen do is, they're actually, a lichen is two organisms. And what it is a combination of one organism is a fungus and one organism is some type of organism that is photosynthetic. So let's say it's like an algae. And now this algae, they need the light to go ahead and make food for themselves. So in this case, the fungus and the algae, they really need each other. They have a mutualistic relationship. They benefit from each other. So the fungus actually protects the algae from the harsh and extreme conditions of the area. So for instance, if there's no water, this fungus is really good at retaining water to help the algae. And in turn, what the algae is going to do is it's going to go ahead and make food for both of them. Now what happens is also these lichen, they go ahead and they change that nitrogen that we can find in the atmosphere, and they change it into nitrogen that organisms can use. And also in the process, the rock that they were on, they'll break it down and they'll add nutrients into the soil. And in this case, you can see what happens in primary succession through this picture. You have in this area, it's once first bare rock, and then the lichens come by and kind of populate the area. They'll settle on rocks, break it down, add nutrients to the soil. And then as time goes on, more seeds can be blown into the area or be carried by organisms, and they'll start to populate the area. So now you'll start to see more shrubs and grasses, and then over time trees will start to grow. Now if you take a look at how long this process takes, it actually takes hundreds of years to go ahead and to go through this process. Because you're starting from scratch. You start with bare land. No nutrients, just bare rock. What follows this, as more organisms start to populate the area, is actually secondary succession. So secondary succession follows primary succession, or it follows a disturbance that didn't completely wipe out the area. So things like a forest fire or a flood or maybe some type of human activity like logging or farming, it doesn't completely wipe out the area. It doesn't take out all of the living things that are there. It doesn't take all the nutrients from the soil. It kind of leaves it somewhat intact. There might be organisms that were not able to survive, but there were some that were able to survive. So if you take a look at the timeline of this secondary succession happens a lot more faster than primary succession because the soil was able to survive. Some organisms were able to survive. And as a result, new producers or surviving producers are able to regrow again, and a lot more faster than they would in primary succession. Now the whole point of succession is to reach this climax community. And the climax community is a stable community where there's some type of balance between animal and plants and plant life. Now, not all communities will go ahead and reach climax community the same way. That's because there might be some changes that occur. Maybe there's more disturbances that occur in the area where you won't always follow, each community won't always follow the same path in how they change over time. So succession doesn't always follow the same path, and the climax communities are not always the same. They're not uniform. They're not going to be always stable. For instance, some secondary succession will return back to its original state and have a stable environment. But other times, because of things that occur, disturbances that occur in the environment, it's not going to reach how it was before. It's not going to reach that climax community. So for instance, things like clearing out an area and farming in it. Because we're changing the area up a bit, because we're continually farming, we're changing up things in the soil, it's not going to go ahead and the original producers that were once there are not going to automatically come back, or they might not come back at all because we're changing up the area so frequently. So just to go ahead and summarize, we have two types of successions. One is primary succession, where after some type of disturbance, everything was wiped out. You got to start over from scratch. And then we have secondary succession, where there was some type of disturbance, but you don't have to start over from the beginning, because there was some organisms, some producers that were able to survive, and the soil still has that nutrients that's there.